What if I told you that many BCBA candidates spend hundreds of hours studying, yet still fail because they misunderstand a handful of foundational concepts? The biggest mistakes on the BCBA exam rarely come from advanced topics, they come from the basic principles that everything else is built on. If these concepts are unclear, every assessment, intervention, and scenario question becomes much harder. Stay with me until the end because this complete study guide is designed to help you build that foundation step by step. And don't forget to check the description where you can download a free BCBA study guide packed with some of the most important exam questions to boost your preparation. Welcome to your BCBA Ultimate Study Guide for 2026. In this first section, we will explore the core philosophy and fundamental principles of applied behavior analysis, the knowledge that every successful board-certified behavior analyst must understand. You will learn why behavior happens, how environmental factors influence learning, and how these scientific principles guide real-world assessments and behavior intervention plans. These ideas are not just important for passing the BCBA exam, they form the framework for every decision you will make as a behavior analyst throughout your career. By the end of this lesson, you will have a much stronger understanding of the concepts that appear throughout the exam and in professional practice. So grab your notes, stay focused, and let's begin building the strong foundation that will support every section that follows. To begin our journey, we must first understand the broad concept of behaviorism, which is the philosophy of the science of behavior. Behaviorism assumes that all behavior is a result of interactions with the environment, rather than internal mental states like hidden thoughts or sudden moods. When you take the exam, remember that behavior analysts focus heavily on what can be seen, measured, and objectively recorded. This does not mean emotions do not exist, but rather that we look to the surrounding physical environment to explain why a person acts the way they do. Understanding this objective viewpoint is your very first step toward thinking like a true behavior analyst. A key assumption within behaviorism is determinism, which is the belief that the universe is a lawful and orderly place. In applied behavior analysis, determinism means that behavior does not happen out of nowhere, but rather, it is determined by specific, observable causes. If a child suddenly throws a tantrum, determinism tells us there is a logical reason for it, such as wanting a toy or trying to escape a difficult math task. On the exam, you will need to recognize determinism as the foundation for why we assess behavior, because if behavior were completely random, our interventions would never work. Grasping this concept allows you to confidently look for the root causes of any action. Another essential attitude of science you must know is empiricism, which is the practice of objective observation and measurement of the phenomena of interest. Empiricism is what makes applied behavior analysis a hard science, relying on clear data rather than opinions, guesses, or subjective feelings. In a real-world clinic, empiricism means taking direct data on exactly how many times a client hits their desk, rather than simply writing down that they seemed angry today. Exam questions will often test your ability to choose objective, empirical measurements over subjective interpretations. Always remember that empiricism is about looking closely at the facts and recording them accurately. As you analyze behavior, you must always apply the rule of parsimony, which dictates that the simplest and most logical explanation must be ruled out before considering more complex causes. Imagine a student is falling asleep in class, and you could guess they have a rare sleep disorder, or you could first check if they stayed up late playing video games. Parsimony requires us to look at the lack of sleep first, because it requires the fewest assumptions and is the simplest explanation. The BCBA exam frequently tests parsimony by presenting a scenario and asking you to identify the most logical, straightforward reason for a behavior. Embracing parsimony will save you time and keep your interventions practical and grounded. Pragmatism is another philosophical pillar that focuses on the practical outcomes of an intervention or theory. In behavior analysis, we evaluate our methods based on whether they actually work to produce a meaningful behavior change in the real world. If a beautiful, complex intervention plan looks great on paper but fails to help the client learn a new skill, a pragmatic behavior analyst will discard it and try something else. You will see exam questions that ask you to prioritize interventions that are proven effective over those that just sound good in theory. Pragmatism ensures that our primary focus always remains on improving the daily lives of the people we serve. You must clearly understand the difference between methodological behaviorism and B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism for the exam. Methodological behaviorism only considers observable public events, entirely ignoring internal private events like thoughts and feelings because they cannot be seen by others. Radical behaviorism, which is the philosophy our field is built upon, argues that thoughts and feelings are also behaviors, they just happen beneath the skin where only the individual can observe them. Skinner proposed that these private events are subject to the exact same environmental laws as public behaviors like walking or talking. Knowing that radical behaviorism includes everything a person does, both public and private, is a crucial distinction for your test. Let us define the actual subject matter we study, starting with the difference between behavior and a response. Behavior is a broad term that refers to a larger set or class of actions that a living organism makes, interacting with the environment. A response, on the other hand, is a single, specific instance of that behavior occurring in real time. For example, crying is a behavior, but a single tear falling down a cheek at 3 o'clock is a specific response. The exam will often use these terms interchangeably in casual scenarios, but you must know the technical distinction that a response is just one isolated occurrence of a larger behavior. Building on that concept, a response class is a group of responses that may look completely different, but all serve the exact same function or purpose in the environment. Imagine you want to get your friend's attention, so you might yell their name, tap their shoulder, or wave your hand in the air. These actions look completely different physically, but they all belong to the same response class because they all result in your friend looking at you. Recognizing response classes is vital for the exam and your career, because you will often need to teach a client a safe replacement behavior that belongs to the same response class as an unsafe behavior. We always focus on the outcome or function the behavior achieves. Behavior never happens in a vacuum, which brings us to the concepts of environment and stimulus. The environment is the entire constellation of circumstances in which the organism exists, including everything both outside and inside the body. A stimulus is a specific energy change within that environment that affects the organism through its receptor cells, like a bright light, a loud noise, or a sudden change in temperature. On the BCBA exam, you will need to identify specific stimuli that trigger or follow behaviors, because manipulating these stimuli is exactly how we change behavior. Understanding the environment as a collection of shifting stimuli is a core requirement for any successful behavior plan. Just as we group responses, we also group stimuli into a stimulus class, which is a set of different stimuli that evoke the same response or share common physical, temporal, or functional properties. Think about all the different types of chairs in the world, like a wooden dining chair, a soft recliner, or a metal folding chair. Despite looking very different, they all belong to the same stimulus class because they all evoke the behavior of sitting. Exam questions often ask you to identify stimulus classes to see if you understand how clients generalize learning across different objects or situations. Teaching a client to recognize a broad stimulus class helps them apply what they learn in the clinic to the real world. Now we will look at how learning occurs, starting with respondent conditioning, which is heavily associated with Ivan Pavlov and his famous salivating dogs. Respondent conditioning involves involuntary, reflexive behaviors that are elicited by antecedent stimuli, meaning the trigger happens before the behavior. For example, if a doctor taps your knee with a small hammer, your leg kicks forward involuntarily, regardless of the consequences that follow. On the exam, remember that respondent behaviors are not learned through rewards or punishments, but are natural reflexes that can be paired with new triggers through classical conditioning. This concept is the basis for understanding phobias, anxiety responses, and basic biological reflexes. In contrast to respondent conditioning, operant conditioning is the primary focus of applied behavior analysis and was pioneered by B.F. Skinner. Operant conditioning deals with voluntary behaviors that are shaped, maintained, and altered by their consequences, meaning what happens after the behavior dictates if it will happen again. If you tell a joke and your friends laugh, that positive consequence makes it highly likely you will tell that joke again in the future. The BCBA exam focuses heavily on operant conditioning, as almost all of our therapeutic interventions involve changing consequences to increase good behaviors or decrease challenging ones. Memorize the rule that respondent behavior is pulled by antecedents, while operant behavior is pushed by consequences. The foundational building block of operant conditioning is the three-term contingency, commonly known as the ABCs of behavior, which stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent is what happens immediately before the behavior is the action itself, and the consequence is what happens immediately following the action. If a teacher asks a question, which is the antecedent, the student raises their hand, which is the behavior, and the teacher praises the student, which is the consequence. The exam requires you to break down complex scenarios into these three simple parts so you can figure out exactly why a behavior is happening. Mastering the three-term contingency is the most important skill you will develop as an instructional designer of human behavior. To change operant behavior, we use reinforcement, which is defined as any consequence that increases the future likelihood of a behavior occurring under similar conditions. Positive reinforcement involves adding a desirable stimulus after a behavior, like giving a child a sticker for finishing their math homework. Negative reinforcement involves removing an aversive stimulus after a behavior, like putting on sunglasses to escape the bright glare of the sun. The exam will try to trick you by using the word negative to mean bad, but you must remember that in behavior analysis, positive simply means adding something, and negative means removing something. Both types of reinforcement strictly serve to increase or maintain behavior. While reinforcement increases behavior, punishment is defined as any consequence that decreases the future likelihood of a behavior occurring. Just like reinforcement, punishment can be positive, which means adding an unpleasant stimulus, like getting a speeding ticket for driving too fast. Punishment can also be negative, which means removing a preferred stimulus, like taking away a teenager's phone because they broke curfew. When tackling exam questions about punishment, always ask yourself two questions. Did the behavior decrease, and was a stimulus added or removed? Keeping these definitions strictly mathematical, as adding or subtracting stimuli, will protect you from common exam pitfalls. Another fundamental principle of behavior change is extinction, which occurs when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced, resulting in a decrease in that behavior over time. If you put money into a vending machine and press the button, but no snack comes out, you will eventually stop putting money into that broken machine because your behavior is on extinction. It is critical to know for the exam that extinction is not the same as ignoring a person. It is specifically withholding the exact reinforcement that previously maintained the target behavior. Understanding the mechanics of extinction is vital because it is a safer, often more ethical alternative to punishment when trying to reduce harmful behaviors. To truly understand why behavior occurs, you must grasp motivating operations, which are environmental variables that temporarily alter the value of a reinforcer and change the frequency of behaviors associated with getting that reinforcer. For example, if you have not drank water in several hours, this deprivation acts as a motivating operation that makes water highly valuable, making you much more likely to walk to the kitchen and pour a glass. On the exam, you will need to differentiate between antecedents that trigger a behavior and motivating operations that make the person actually care about the consequence. Recognizing when a client is motivated or satiated is a daily requirement for running effective therapy sessions. Finally, we must distinguish between contingency-shaped behavior and rule-governed behavior, which explains how humans learn without having to experience consequences directly. Contingency-shaped behavior is learned through direct experience with consequences, like touching a hot stove and getting burned, which quickly teaches you not to do it again. Rule-governed behavior is controlled by a verbal or written description of a contingency, such as seeing a wet floor sign and walking carefully around the puddle without actually slipping. The BCBA exam frequently tests your ability to identify rule-governed behavior, because our ultimate goal is often to teach clients how to follow rules and instructions to keep them safe and independent in society. Congratulations on successfully completing the first section of your BCBA Ultimate Study Guide. You have taken a massive step by mastering the foundational philosophies, behavioral definitions, and basic principles that govern learning. To truly lock in these new concepts, I highly encourage you to complete the attached practice test right now, before moving forward. Practice questions are proven to dramatically improve your long-term retention, build your test-taking confidence, and ensure you are fully prepared for the real exam. The practice test is included right here with this lesson to support your active learning journey. Finish those questions, review your answers, and I will see you in the next section where we will tackle measurement and data display. Welcome to the second section of your certification journey. In this lesson, you will learn how we accurately track, record, and visually display behavior. This topic is incredibly important because reliable data is the lifeblood of applied behavior analysis, guiding every single clinical decision we make. I am excited to help you master these measurement tools, as they will completely transform how you evaluate your future clients. Get ready to take some excellent notes and prepare yourself to conquer one of the most critical topics on the exam. We will start by exploring continuous measurement procedures, which are methods designed to capture every single instance of a behavior during an observation period. This approach is highly accurate because it leaves absolutely nothing out, giving you a complete picture of what is happening. On the exam, you should select continuous measurement when the behavior has a clear beginning and end, and when you have the dedicated time to watch the client without interruption. Understanding when to use continuous measurement ensures your clinical data perfectly reflects reality. The most straightforward continuous measurement tool is count, which is simply tallying the exact number of times a specific behavior occurs. For example, if a child raises their hand 5 times during a math lesson, your total count is exactly 5. While count is very easy to record, you must remember for the exam that it is only useful if your observation periods are exactly the same length every time. If your observation times vary from day to day, simply counting the behavior will give you skewed and highly misleading data. To solve the problem of varying observation times, we use rate, which combines your count with a specific unit of time. If a client claps their hands 10 times in a 2-hour session, the rate is exactly 5 claps per hour. The certification exam frequently tests your ability to calculate rate because it allows you to compare behavior across sessions of different lengths accurately and fairly. Always choose rate over a simple count when you need a standardized measure of how often a behavior is happening. Sometimes we care more about how long a behavior lasts rather than how often it happens, which is when we use duration. Duration measures the total amount of time from the very beginning of the response to its complete end. If a client exhibits a severe tantrum, knowing it lasted for 45 minutes is far more important than knowing it only happened one time today. Exam questions will frequently ask you to select duration when the overall length of the behavior is your primary clinical concern. Another critical continuous measure is latency, which is the amount of time that passes between a specific instruction and the moment the client actually starts the behavior. Imagine you ask a student to open their book, and it takes them 3 full minutes to finally touch the cover. That 3-minute delay is the latency of their response. You will use latency in the field, and see it on the test, when the ultimate goal is to teach a client to respond much more quickly to important cues or instructions. Closely related to latency is interresponse time, which measures the amount of time that elapses between 2 consecutive instances of the exact same behavior. If a client takes a bite of food, pauses for 5 minutes, and then takes a second bite, the interresponse time is 5 minutes. On the exam, remember that interresponse time is directly related to rate, because if the time between behaviors gets shorter, the overall rate of the behavior is rapidly increasing. We often target interresponse time when we want a client to work at a faster or slower pace. When you cannot watch a client every single second, you must use discontinuous measurement procedures, which only capture a sample of behavior during specific intervals of time. These methods are highly practical for busy classrooms or crowded clinics where an observer has to manage multiple tasks at once. However, the exam wants you to know that discontinuous measurement always carries the risk of slightly overestimating or underestimating the true occurrence of the behavior. You must carefully weigh the convenience of these methods against the slight loss of perfect accuracy. The first discontinuous method is partial interval recording, where you divide the observation session into short intervals and simply mark if the behavior happened at any point during that time. It does not matter if the behavior lasted for 1 second or the entire interval, you simply record a yes if it occurred at all. You need to remember for your exam that partial interval recording tends to overestimate behavior. Because it naturally overestimates, it is the absolute best choice when your goal is to decrease a harmful or disruptive behavior. In contrast, whole interval recording requires the behavior to happen continuously for the entire duration of the interval to be counted. If your interval is 10 seconds and the behavior completely stops at 9 seconds, you must record a no for that block of time. The certification test will emphasize that whole interval recording tends to underestimate behavior. Therefore, it is the perfect measurement system to use when your clinical goal is to increase a positive, continuous behavior like staying on task or reading quietly. Momentary time sampling is the most convenient discontinuous method, where you only check to see if the behavior is happening at the exact moment the interval ends. Imagine setting a timer for 5 minutes, and when it beeps, you quickly glance at the student to see if they are actively working. This method is highly tested because it allows a teacher to run an entire classroom while still collecting useful clinical data. It is widely considered the best measurement choice when the observer is extremely busy with other professional responsibilities. Sometimes you do not need to observe the behavior happening at all, which is exactly when you measure by permanent product. This method measures the physical outcome or lingering effect the behavior leaves behind in the natural environment. Grading a completed math worksheet, counting the number of broken windows, or checking to see if a bed is made are all examples of measuring a permanent product. The exam will ask you to identify permanent product recording as the best option when the behavior reliably produces a specific physical result. To fully trust our data, it must possess 3 crucial indicators of quality, which are validity, reliability, and accuracy. Validity means you are actually measuring the specific target behavior you intended to measure, rather than something entirely different. Reliability means your measurement tool yields the exact same results upon repeated use, just like a good bathroom scale always shows the same weight. Accuracy means your observed data perfectly matches the true, objective value of what actually happened in reality. To ensure our data is trustworthy, we calculate inter-observer agreement, which involves having 2 independent observers measure the exact same behavior at the exact same time. We then compare the data sheets to see how closely their recordings match one another. High inter-observer agreement proves that your definition of the target behavior is crystal clear and that your measurement system is highly reliable. Exam questions frequently require you to understand that we use this process to detect human error and prevent observer drift. Once we collect accurate data, we must display it visually, and the most common tool we use is the simple line graph. Line graphs plot data points over time, allowing us to immediately see trends, levels, and variability in a client's daily behavior. On your certification exam, the line graph is treated as the absolute gold standard for monitoring progress and making quick, objective clinical decisions. You must become incredibly comfortable reading line graphs to determine if an intervention is actually working in the real world. Every standard line graph in our field features a horizontal axis and a vertical axis that serve very specific functions. The horizontal axis always represents the passage of time, such as days, weeks, or individual therapy sessions. The vertical axis always represents the value of the target behavior we are measuring, such as the total count, rate, or percentage of correct answers. Knowing the strict placement of time on the bottom and behavior on the side is a foundational rule you absolutely must memorize. When looking at a line graph, you will often see vertical lines cutting through the data path, which are known as phase change lines. These lines indicate that a significant change occurred in the client's environment, most commonly the introduction of a brand new treatment or intervention. By comparing the data points before the line with the data points after the line, we can visually interpret if the new intervention caused a meaningful behavior change. Recognizing phase change lines is essential for answering visual analysis questions on your test. While line graphs track changes over time, bar graphs are used to summarize and compare massive amounts of data across different categories. For example, you might use a bar graph to quickly show a parent the total number of aggressive behaviors their child displayed across 4 different teachers. However, because bar graphs do not show daily changes over time, they cannot be used to monitor the day-to-day effectiveness of a therapy intervention. The exam expects you to choose bar graphs strictly for simple comparisons and displaying broad summary data. Another specialized visual tool you need to know is the scatterplot, which is used to discover hidden patterns in the exact timing of a behavior. A scatterplot marks precisely when a behavior occurs throughout the day, helping you see if a client only exhibits tantrums during specific times, like right before lunch. This visual display is highly useful during the early stages of an assessment when you are trying to figure out environmental triggers. Expect exam scenarios where you must select a scatterplot to pinpoint the time of day a challenging behavior naturally peaks. Congratulations on successfully completing the second section of your ultimate study guide. You have just mastered the complex world of measurement systems, data quality, and visual analysis. I highly encourage you to complete the attached practice test right now to reinforce everything we just covered together. Practice questions dramatically improve your long-term retention and boost your overall exam readiness. Remember that the practice test is included right here with this lesson to support your active learning. Keep up this incredible momentum, and I will see you in the next section where we will tackle experimental design and behavior assessment. Welcome back to the third section of your BCBA Ultimate Study Guide, where we are going to explore experimental design and behavior assessment. In this lesson, you will learn how to identify target behaviors, conduct thorough functional behavior assessments, and use single-subject experimental designs to prove your interventions actually cause behavior change. This topic is incredibly important because it bridges the gap between simply observing behavior and scientifically analyzing its root causes, which is the exact hallmark of being a true behavior analyst. I am excited to guide you through these powerful methods, so let us get ready to unlock the secrets of behavioral science. Before we can change any behavior, we must clearly define what we are looking at by creating an operational definition. An operational definition describes the behavior in clear, observable, and measurable terms so that anyone reading it can record it exactly the same way. For example, instead of writing that a client is aggressive, you would write that aggression means hitting another person with an open palm from a distance of more than 6 inches. On your certification exam, you will often be asked to pick the best operational definition out of a list, so always look for the option that is objective and leaves no room for guessing. When selecting target behaviors, a behavior analyst must ensure the change is socially significant, meaning it actually improves the client's quality of life. We often look for a behavioral cusp, which is a behavior change that exposes the person to totally new environments, reinforces, and contingencies that were previously out of reach. Learning to crawl is a classic behavioral cusp for an infant because it suddenly opens up a whole world of new objects and places to explore. The exam will test your ability to prioritize target behaviors that act as cusps because they maximize the client's long-term independence and learning opportunities. Behavioral assessment is a systematic method for gathering information to figure out the exact function or purpose of a challenging behavior. We never guess why a behavior is happening. Instead, we use a mix of indirect, direct, and experimental assessment methods to gather evidence. Passing your test requires you to know the strengths and weaknesses of each assessment level so you can choose the right one for any clinical situation. This process ensures we do not waste time on ineffective treatments and can pinpoint the exact environmental variables maintaining the behavior. Indirect assessments are the first and least intrusive level of behavioral assessment, involving interviews, checklists, and rating scales completed by people who know the client well. You might interview a parent or ask a teacher to fill out a questionnaire about when a child's tantrums usually happen. While indirect assessments are fast and easy to complete, the exam will remind you that they are highly subjective and rely entirely on human memory. Because of this limitation, you should only use indirect assessments as a starting point to help you form initial hypotheses, never as your sole piece of evidence. Direct descriptive assessment involves observing the client in their natural environment and recording behaviors as they happen without changing anything. The most common tool used here is ABC data collection, where you write down the exact antecedent, behavior, and consequence as they unfold in real time. For example, you might observe a student during a reading lesson and notice they tear up the paper every time they are handed a difficult worksheet. The exam places a heavy emphasis on direct assessment because it provides objective, real-time data about what is actually triggering and maintaining the behavior in everyday life. The highest and most accurate level of assessment is a functional analysis, which involves systematically manipulating environmental antecedents and consequences to see their direct effect on behavior. Unlike descriptive assessments that just show correlations, a functional analysis allows you to definitively prove a cause and effect relationship. During a functional analysis, you intentionally set up specific conditions to see which one triggers the highest rate of the behavior. On the test, remember that a functional analysis is the absolute gold standard for discovering the true function of a behavior, despite requiring the most expertise to run safely. A standard functional analysis tests several specific conditions, beginning with the attention and escape conditions. In the attention condition, the therapist ignores the client and only provides attention when the target behavior occurs to see if the behavior is maintained by social attention. In the escape condition, The therapist delivers a difficult task and immediately removes the task for a short break if the client misbehaves, testing if the behavior is maintained by escaping work. The exam will expect you to analyze graphs of these conditions to determine which consequence is actively reinforcing the client's behavior. The remaining standard functional analysis conditions are the alone condition and the play condition, which serves as our control. In the alone condition, the client is placed in a barren room with no materials and no people to see if the behavior occurs without any social triggers, which indicates an automatic or sensory function. The play condition is a relaxed environment where the client has free access to toys, attention, and no demands, meaning the behavior should rarely happen here. If a behavior is high across all conditions or highest in the alone condition, the exam will tip you off that the behavior is automatically reinforcing itself. Once you complete your assessment and design a treatment, you must use single-subject experimental design to prove that your intervention is what caused the behavior change. In these designs, the client serves as their own control, meaning we compare their behavior during treatment directly to their own behavior before treatment started. This is completely different from group research designs that compare large numbers of people using averages and statistics. The test will evaluate your understanding of how single-subject designs allow us to make data-driven decisions for individual clients in clinical practice. To prove an intervention works in single-subject design, you must understand baseline logic, which consists of prediction, verification, and replication. Prediction is looking at your initial baseline data and anticipating where the behavior would go if you never introduced a treatment. Verification occurs when you demonstrate that the baseline level of behavior would have stayed the same if you had not stepped in with an intervention. Replication happens when you introduce the treatment a second time and achieve the exact same behavior change, which heavily increases your confidence that the treatment is the real cause of success. The most powerful single-subject tool is the reversal design, often called an ABAB design, where you alternate between baseline phases and treatment phases. You start with an initial baseline phase, introduce your intervention, then withdraw the intervention to return to baseline, and finally reintroduce the treatment. If the behavior improves during treatment, worsens when withdrawn, and improves again when reintroduced, you have clear experimental control. The exam will warn you that you should never use a reversal design for dangerous behaviors like self-injury, because it is highly unethical to intentionally make a dangerous behavior return. When you need to compare two or more different interventions quickly, you should choose the alternating treatments design. In this design, two or more treatments are rapidly alternated across sessions, often on the same day, allowing you to see which one works best without a long baseline phase. For example, you might use a token system in the morning and a praise-only system in the afternoon to see which one reduces talking out of turn faster. The exam will highlight this design as an excellent choice because it does not require you to withdraw a treatment, making it highly practical for fast-paced clinical settings. If you cannot withdraw a treatment due to safety or because the behavior cannot be unlearned, the multiple baseline design is your best option. This design allows you to demonstrate experimental control by staggering the introduction of your intervention across different points in time. You gather baseline data simultaneously for multiple subjects, settings, or behaviors, and then introduce the treatment to one at a time while keeping the others in baseline. If each baseline only changes at the exact moment the treatment is introduced, you have successfully proven that your intervention is the driving force behind the change. A multiple baseline across subjects design is used when you want to apply the exact same intervention to the same behavior of three or more different individuals. You start collecting baseline data on all three clients at the same time, but you only give the intervention to the first client on day 5, the second client on day 10, and the third client on day 15. The certification test will look for you to identify this specific layout on a graph by checking if the staggered treatment lines start at different times for each distinct person. It is one of the most widely used designs in schools and clinics today. A multiple baseline across settings design is applied when you are working with a single client who needs to change one specific behavior across several environments, like home, school, and the clinic. You observe the client's behavior in all three locations simultaneously under baseline conditions to establish a clear pattern. Then, you introduce your behavior plan only in the home setting, while continuing to monitor school and clinic without any intervention. Once the home behavior improves, you roll the plan out to the school, and eventually to the clinic, proving the plan works regardless of the physical setting. The final variation is the multiple baseline across behaviors design, which targets two or more distinct behaviors within the exact same individual. For example, you might want to teach a client how to wash their hands, brush their teeth, and comb their hair using the same teaching method. You track all three skills in baseline, and then systematically introduce the teaching method to hand washing first, followed by teeth brushing, and finally hair combing. The exam tests your ability to match this design to clinical scenarios where a single client needs help with a variety of independent skills. When your goal is to change a behavior gradually in step-by-step increments, you should utilize the changing criterion design. This design features a single baseline phase followed by a series of treatment phases, where each new phase requires a slightly higher or lower level of performance to earn reinforcement. Imagine helping a smoker cut down on cigarettes by setting a goal of 15 a day, then 12, then 9, and finally 0. On your exam, look for a graph that resembles a staircase, where the behavior must closely match each new step to prove your intervention is maintaining tight control. As you select your experimental designs, you must always balance internal validity and external validity to ensure your results are truly meaningful. Internal validity is the degree to which you can confidently prove that your independent variable, the treatment, is what actually caused the change in your dependent variable, the behavior. External validity is the degree to which your successful results can be generalized to other people, settings, or behaviors outside of your specific study. Single subject designs naturally excel at providing high internal validity, but require multiple replications across different individuals to build strong external validity. Congratulations on successfully completing the third section of your BCBA Ultimate Study Guide. You have achieved a major milestone by mastering behavioral assessments, operational definitions, and the complex experimental designs used to prove scientific control. To firmly solidify this advanced knowledge, I highly encourage you to complete the attached practice test right now before taking a break. Engaging with practice questions is a powerful form of active learning that drastically improves your retention, sharpens your critical thinking, and ensures you are ready for exam day. The practice test is included right here with this lesson, so take full advantage of it, review your answers carefully, and I will see you in the next section where we will dive deep into behavior change procedures and interventions. Welcome to the fourth section of your BCBA Ultimate Study Guide, focusing entirely on behavior change procedures and interventions. In this lesson, you will learn the exact practical tools we use every single day to increase desired behaviors and decrease harmful ones. This topic is the absolute heart of applied behavior analysis, shifting our focus from simply measuring behavior to actively improving a client's life. I am thrilled to walk you through these strategies, because mastering them means you are ready to create real, lasting change in the real world. Take a deep breath, get your notes ready, and let us explore the mechanics of behavior change. The first critical concept you must understand is a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement means that you provide a reward every single time a specific behavior occurs, without exception. If you are teaching a child to say the word apple, you give them a piece of apple every single time they say it correctly. On your exam, remember that continuous reinforcement is the absolute best schedule to use when you are teaching a brand new skill. This heavy rate of reinforcement helps the learner quickly understand exactly what behavior is expected of them. Once a skill is learned, you must switch to an intermittent schedule of reinforcement to keep the behavior going over time. Intermittent reinforcement means that some correct responses are rewarded, but others are not. If a student already knows how to raise their hand, you might only praise them every third time they do it. The exam will test your knowledge that intermittent schedules are critical for maintaining behaviors and preventing the client from getting too full or bored with the reward. This mirrors the real world, where we rarely get rewarded every single time we do something right. There are 4 basic intermittent schedules you need to memorize, starting with the fixed ratio schedule. A fixed ratio schedule requires an exact, unchanging number of responses before a reward is delivered. For example, a factory worker might get paid exactly $1 for every 5 toys they assemble. On a graph, fixed ratio schedules create a unique break and run pattern, where the person works very fast to get the reward, and then takes a short pause before starting again. Recognizing this specific graph pattern is a very common requirement on the certification test. The most powerful intermittent schedule is the variable ratio schedule, which requires a completely unpredictable, average number of responses to earn a reward. Playing a slot machine is a perfect example, because you never know exactly how many times you must pull the lever before you win the jackpot. This unpredictability creates a very high, steady rate of responding without any pauses, because the next attempt might be the lucky one. You will see exam scenarios where you must choose a variable ratio schedule when you want a behavior to occur very frequently and resist extinction. Moving from numbers to time, we have the fixed interval schedule, which provides a reward for the first correct response after a specific, unchanging amount of time has passed. Imagine a baking timer set for 30 minutes. Checking the oven at 20 minutes earns nothing, but checking exactly when the timer hits 30 minutes results in warm cookies. This schedule creates a scallop pattern on a graph, where the behavior starts slowly and rapidly speeds up right before the time is up. The exam expects you to identify this scallop pattern and link it directly to fixed interval schedules. The final basic schedule is the variable interval schedule, where the reward is available for the first correct response after an unpredictable, average amount of time has passed. Checking your email is a great example, because important messages arrive at random times, so you check at a steady, moderate pace throughout the day. Because the timing is unpredictable, the person cannot figure out exactly when the reward is coming, leading to a consistent rate of behavior without the rushed scallop effect. You should select a variable interval schedule on the exam when you want to maintain a steady, moderate rate of behavior over a long period. When we need to decrease a behavior, we often rely on extinction, which means completely stopping the reinforcement that previously kept the behavior going. However, you must prepare for an extinction burst, which is a temporary, intense increase in the frequency, duration, or intensity of the behavior immediately after extinction begins. If you stop putting money in a broken vending machine, you might push the button harder, shake the machine, and get angry before giving up. Understanding the extinction burst is highly tested, because you must warn parents that the behavior will look much worse before it finally gets better. Another tricky phenomenon associated with extinction is spontaneous recovery, which happens when an extinguished behavior suddenly reappears out of nowhere, even without any reinforcement. Imagine a child who stopped crying for candy months ago, suddenly crying for candy in the grocery store one random afternoon. For your exam, you must remember that spontaneous recovery is short-lived, and if you simply continue the extinction procedure, the behavior will fade away again very quickly. Recognizing this concept prevents professionals from mistakenly believing their intervention has completely failed. To make behavior reduction safer and more effective, we almost always combine extinction with differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement involves heavily reinforcing one specific positive behavior while placing another challenging behavior on total extinction. This means you are teaching the client exactly what to do instead, rather than just telling them what not to do. The exam features many scenarios where choosing differential reinforcement is the most ethical and effective treatment option available, because it builds new skills while reducing harm. Let us explore the specific types of differential reinforcement you will see on the test. The first variation is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, commonly referred to as DRA. In a DRA procedure, you reinforce a specific, appropriate replacement behavior that serves the exact same function as the problem behavior. If a student screams to get the teacher's attention, you would place the screaming on extinction, and only give attention when the student politely raises their hand. By directly teaching a functional, alternative way to communicate, you ensure the client gets their needs met safely, making DRA an incredibly popular and highly tested intervention. Another variation is differential reinforcement of other behavior, known as DRO, where you deliver reinforcement whenever the problem behavior completely fails to occur for a specific amount of time. If a child goes 5 full minutes without hitting anyone, they earn a token, regardless of whatever else they were doing during that time. The catch with DRO is that you might accidentally reinforce a different bad behavior, like spitting, simply because the child was not hitting. The exam will test your understanding of this precise risk, expecting you to know when DRO is appropriate and when it is dangerous. If you want to be extremely precise, you can use differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, or DRI. This means you reinforce a behavior that is physically impossible to do at the exact same time as the problem behavior. For example, if a client frequently bites their own fingernails, You might reinforce them for keeping their hands firmly inside their pockets. Because they cannot bite their nails while their hands are hidden in their pockets, the behaviors are completely incompatible. You must be able to spot the difference between an alternative behavior in DRA and a strictly impossible physical conflict in DRI. When teaching new skills, we frequently use prompts, which are extra hints or cues given before or during a behavior to help the client perform it correctly. Stimulus prompts involve changing the physical materials, like making the correct puzzle piece brightly colored so it stands out. Response prompts involve acting directly on the client, like verbally telling him the answer or physically guiding their hand to write their name. Prompts are essential for preventing frustration during learning, and the exam will require you to clearly distinguish between changes to the materials and changes to the person. While prompts are helpful, you must eventually remove them so the client can perform the skill independently, a process known as prompt fading. If you are using most to least prompting, you start with heavy physical guidance and slowly fade to lighter touches, gestures, and eventually nothing. If you use least to most prompting, you start with zero help and only add prompts if the client makes a mistake. The certification test emphasizes that failing to fade prompts properly leads to prompt dependency, where the client refuses to work without someone giving him a hint. When a completely new behavior does not exist in a client's repertoire at all, we use a procedure called shaping to build it from scratch. Shaping involves reinforcing successive approximations toward a final target behavior, rewarding tiny steps that get closer and closer to the goal. If you are teaching a child to say water, you might first reward them for making a W sound, then for saying wa, and finally only for the full word. Knowing how to systematically shift your criteria for reinforcement is a core concept that demonstrates your mastery of teaching complex vocal and physical skills. Shaping is used for a single behavior, but when you need to teach a sequence of many different behaviors, you use a process called chaining. Chaining breaks down a complex task, like washing hands, into smaller, manageable steps called the task analysis. You can teach the steps using forward chaining, starting with the first step, backward chaining, starting with the final step for immediate success, or total task chaining, teaching every step at once. The exam will give you complex clinical scenarios and ask you to select the absolute best chaining method based on the learner's current abilities. To maintain behavior over long periods, especially in group settings, behavior analysts frequently rely on token economies. A token economy is a system where a client earns generalized conditioned reinforcers, like small plastic coins or stickers, for displaying target behaviors. These tokens have no value on their own, but they become highly motivating because they can later be exchanged for backup reinforcers, like extra recess time or a favorite toy. Managing a token economy requires careful planning, and your test will check if you know how to adjust the prices of backup items to keep motivation high. Finally, when a client is highly resistant to following instructions, you can use the high-probability request sequence, also known as behavioral momentum. This involves giving the client 3 or 4 very easy requests that they are highly likely to follow, praising them for each, and then immediately giving the difficult request. Asking a child to touch their nose, clap their hands, give a high five, and then suddenly asking them to clean their room builds a fast pattern of compliance. This simple but incredibly effective strategy is heavily tested because it prevents escape behaviors without using any punishment. Congratulations on successfully completing the 4th section of your Ultimate Study Guide. You have just mastered the complex world of reinforcement schedules, differential reinforcement, shaping, chaining, and practical behavior change strategies. I strongly encourage you to complete the attached practice test right now to secure these critical concepts in your memory. Answering practice questions is the single most effective way to improve your retention and prepare for the tricky wording of the certification exam. The practice test is included right here with this lesson for your convenience, so dive in, verify your knowledge, and I will see you in the next section focusing on client-centered interventions. Welcome to the 5th section of your Ultimate Study Guide, where we transition into client-centered interventions and maintenance. In this lesson, you will learn how to make sure the skills you teach actually stick around and work in the real world, long after you leave the room. This topic is incredibly vital because our goal is not just to make a client perform well in a clinic, but to grant them true independence in their daily lives. I am thrilled to explore these concepts with you, as this is where the science truly transforms into life-changing care. Get comfortable, Prepare to focus, and let us learn how to make your hard work last a lifetime. The absolute ultimate goal of applied behavior analysis is generalization, which means the client uses their new skills outside of the exact conditions where they were taught. If you teach a child to tie their shoes in the therapy center, but they cannot do it at home or at school, your intervention is not truly complete. The exam will repeatedly test your understanding that a skill is functionally useless if it only exists in a vacuum under the strict supervision of a therapist. We must actively plan for behavior to spread to new environments, new people, and new materials. The first specific type you must know is stimulus generalization, which happens when a trained behavior occurs in the presence of new, untrained triggers. For example, if you teach a child to say dog when they see a picture of a golden retriever, and they later say dog when they see a real poodle walking down the street, stimulus generalization has occurred. On the test, remember that the client is doing the exact same behavior, but they are doing it in response to a completely different physical stimulus. This is how we learn to navigate a complex world without having to be taught every single object individually. On the other hand, response generalization happens when a client starts emitting brand new, untrained behaviors that serve the exact same function as the original trained behavior. If you teach a student to greet their teacher by saying good morning, and the next day they independently wave their hand or say hello instead, you are seeing response generalization. The exam wants you to recognize that the trigger is the same, but the physical action the person takes has changed. Encouraging response generalization gives your clients a rich, flexible repertoire of skills rather than robotic, memorized reactions. Sometimes a client can generalize too much, which leads to a problem known as overgeneralization. Overgeneralization occurs when a behavior happens in the presence of a stimulus that is similar to the correct trigger, but is actually wrong in that specific context. If a toddler learns to call their father daddy, and then happily points to a stranger in the grocery store and yells daddy, they have overgeneralized the rule. When you see this on the exam, you must remember the solution is to teach stimulus discrimination, helping the client recognize the subtle differences between what is correct and what is not. In the early days of our field, behavior analysts used a method called train and hope, where they taught a skill and simply crossed their fingers that it would generalize. The certification exam will emphasize that training and hoping is never an acceptable professional strategy in modern practice. We also try to avoid sequential modification, which means teaching the skill in one setting, waiting to see if it fails in another setting, and then going to that new setting to teach it all over again. Instead, we must proactively build generalization directly into our lesson plans from the very first day. The most powerful way to ensure a skill lasts is to introduce the client to natural maintaining contingencies. This simply means you teach a behavior that the real world is already set up to heavily reward on its own. For example, if you teach a child how to ask a peer to play a game, the natural fun of playing the game will instantly reinforce the behavior without you needing to give them a sticker. The exam loves scenarios where shifting from artificial clinic rewards to natural social rewards is the key to achieving permanent independence. Another excellent strategy is teaching sufficient exemplars, which means you intentionally teach the skill using a wide variety of different materials, settings, and instructors. If you want a client to learn how to use a public restroom, you should not practice in the exact same bathroom every single day. You need to practice in a loud restaurant bathroom, a quiet library bathroom, and a busy mall bathroom, using different types of sinks and paper towel dispensers. The more variations the client successfully masters during training, the faster they will generalize the skill to every other bathroom they ever encounter. To prevent a client from memorizing specific, irrelevant details, you should use a strategy called training loosely. Training loosely means you intentionally vary the non-critical parts of the teaching environment, like the tone of your voice, the time of day, or the room you are sitting in. If you always teach reading at a small blue table exactly at 9 o'clock, the client might mistakenly believe they can only read at that specific table. The exam will ask you to identify loose training as the best way to stop clients from becoming rigidly stuck to meaningless environmental cues. If you know exactly where the client needs to use the skill eventually, you can use the tactic of programming common stimuli. This involves bringing elements from the natural environment directly into your training room so the client feels familiar with them when they leave. If you are preparing a student to transition into a mainstream public school classroom, you might set up the therapy room with standard school desks, a chalkboard, and the exact same bell sound used at the school. This creates a bridge that makes the leap into the real world much less intimidating for the learner. Once a skill generalizes, your next major hurdle is achieving maintenance, which is the ability of the client to continue performing the behavior long after the official intervention has completely ended. A behavior plan is only truly successful if it eventually becomes entirely unnecessary. Maintenance requires the behavior to become a natural habit that withstands the passage of time without constant reminders, prompting, or artificial rewards. You will be tested on your ability to plan for this eventual fade out right from the start of your therapeutic relationship. The secret to achieving strong maintenance is carefully manipulating your schedules of reinforcement, as we discussed in the previous section. You must slowly thin the reinforcement schedule, moving from continuous, dense rewards to unpredictable, intermittent rewards that mimic the real world. If you suddenly stop giving a child tokens for good behavior, the behavior will crash into an extinction burst. The certification test will require you to understand that slow, systematic fading of rewards is the only reliable way to lock a behavior into a client's permanent repertoire. The ultimate client-centered intervention is self-management, which occurs when a person applies behavior change tactics to their own daily life to alter their own behavior. By teaching a client how to manage themselves, you completely remove the need for a behavior analyst to be present, which is the highest form of independence. This could mean teaching a teenager to set their own phone alarm to remember to take their medication, or teaching an adult to track their daily water intake. The exam prioritizes self-management because it returns power and autonomy directly to the individual. Within self-management, you must differentiate between self-monitoring and self-evaluation. Self-monitoring simply means the person observes and records their own behavior, like putting a checkmark on a piece of paper every time they feel anxious. Self-evaluation goes a step further, requiring the person to compare their recorded behavior against a predetermined goal, like noticing they only felt anxious twice a day when their goal was to keep it under 5. Knowing the difference between merely tracking data and actively judging it against a standard is a common requirement for answering self-management questions correctly. As clients learn to manage their own behaviors, the behavior analyst must actively fade out their own presence and interventions. Fading involves slowly and systematically removing components of a behavior plan until the natural environment is the only thing supporting the client. You might slowly change a heavy token economy into a simple weekly allowance, or move from sitting right next to a student to standing across the room, and eventually leaving the room entirely. Exam questions will expect you to recognize when a client is ready for fading to prevent them from becoming overly dependent on your help. A massive part of client-centered care is person-centered planning, which means actively involving the client in choosing their own goals, interventions, and reinforces whenever possible. We never force a goal onto a client simply because we think it is best. We must ensure the goal holds high social validity for them and their family. Social validity means the client actually cares about the outcome and feels the intervention respects their dignity and personal preferences. Passing the exam requires you to always prioritize the client's voice over the convenience of the clinical staff. Because people change over time, their preferences and reinforces will inevitably change as well, which means you must conduct ongoing preference assessments. A toy that motivated a child at age 5 will likely hold 0 value when they're 10, and failing to recognize this will cause your intervention to fail. You must constantly observe the client, ask them what they like, and formally test new items to ensure your reinforcement system remains highly effective. The exam will test your understanding that a stagnant intervention plan is a failing intervention plan, and adaptation is key. Finally, for interventions to maintain in the real world, you must rely heavily on caregiver and staff training. Behavior analysts cannot be with a client 24 hours a day, so parents, teachers, and direct support staff must become the true agents of change. Providing a beautifully written, 50-page behavior plan to a tired parent is completely useless if you do not actively teach them how to implement it. The test heavily emphasizes your responsibility to empower the people surrounding the client through effective, hands-on training and ongoing support. The gold standard for teaching caregivers is behavioral skills training, commonly abbreviated as BST. BST consists of 4 mandatory steps: giving clear verbal instructions, modeling the skill perfectly for the caregiver, having the caregiver practice the skill in a role-play rehearsal, and providing immediate feedback on their performance. You loop through rehearsal and feedback until the caregiver can perform the intervention flawlessly. You will absolutely see exam questions asking you to identify missing steps in a BST scenario, so memorize instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback right now. Congratulations on successfully completing the 5th section of your study guide. You have taken a massive leap forward by learning how to generalize skills, ensure long-term maintenance, and empower clients through self-management and caregiver training. I strongly encourage you to complete the attached practice test right now to secure this knowledge while it is fresh in your mind. Answering practice questions is an essential step to improve your retention and prepare you for the complex scenarios on the real exam. The practice test is included with this lesson to maximize your active learning, so complete it carefully, and I will see you in the final section covering ethical and professional conduct. Welcome to the final section of your certification preparation, focusing on ethical and professional conduct and personnel supervision. In this lesson, you will learn the strict ethical rules that govern our profession and how to effectively manage the behavior technicians who work under your license. This topic is incredibly vital because having a deep understanding of behavior science means nothing if we do not apply it safely, fairly, and responsibly. I am so proud of how far you have come, and mastering this final piece will prepare you for the heavy emphasis the exam places on professional behavior. Prepare yourself for a great lesson, as protecting our clients and guiding our staff is the highest calling of a behavior analyst. The most fundamental principle guiding our entire profession is the requirement to do no harm. Because behavior analysts often work with highly vulnerable populations, including young children and individuals with severe disabilities, we hold an immense amount of power over their daily lives. On the certification test, you must always evaluate every single scenario through the lens of client safety. If an intervention is highly effective but puts the client in physical or emotional danger, it is strictly unethical and must be immediately rejected. Your primary duty is to protect the well-being of the people you serve above all other concerns. To ensure we all follow the same rules, our field is governed by the BCBA Ethics Code for Behavior Analysts. You must remember for the exam that this code is not just a list of polite suggestions, it is a strictly enforceable document. If a certified professional violates these rules, they can have their license permanently revoked and lose their ability to practice. The test will present you with complex, gray area scenarios, and you must rely entirely on the written rules of the code, rather than your own personal feelings, to determine the correct course of action. A massive focus of the ethics code is avoiding multiple relationships, which happen when a professional simultaneously serves in a behavior analytic role and a completely different personal role with the same client. For example, you absolutely cannot provide therapy to your own nephew, and you cannot hire your client's mother to be your personal accountant. The exam targets this rule heavily because mixing professional and personal lives creates a massive conflict of interest that destroys your clinical objectivity. You must maintain strict, clear boundaries to protect the integrity of your treatment. Closely tied to professional boundaries is the strict policy regarding receiving or giving gifts. Under the current ethics code, behavior analysts and their staff are generally prohibited from accepting gifts from clients or their families, even during holidays. Accepting a gift can subtly alter the power dynamic and make the professional feel obligated to provide special treatment. While there are some tiny exceptions for low-value items under $10, the safest and most tested rule is to politely decline gifts while explaining that it is a strict board policy. Treating clients with dignity and respect is another cornerstone of our ethical framework. This means we never speak about a client as if they are not in the room, and we never use degrading language to describe their challenging behaviors. Furthermore, providing dignity means constantly offering the client choices throughout their day, from what they wear to what activities they participate in. The certification exam frequently asks how to preserve dignity, and the correct answer always involves giving the client a voice and treating them like an equal human being. Protecting a client's private information is legally and ethically required, which brings us to the rules of confidentiality. You cannot share clinical records, videos, or even confirm that a person is your client without explicit written permission from them or their legal guardian. However, the exam will test your knowledge of the mandatory exceptions to this rule. You are legally required to immediately break confidentiality and report to the authorities if you suspect the client is being abused, or if they pose a severe and imminent danger to themselves or others. Before you can begin any assessment or treatment, you must obtain informed consent from the client or their legal representative. For consent to be valid, it requires 3 specific elements: capacity, information, and voluntariness. Capacity means the person is mentally capable of making a decision, information means they fully understand the risks and benefits, and voluntariness means they are signing without any pressure or threats. If any one of these 3 elements is missing, the consent is completely invalid, and you absolutely cannot proceed with your clinical work. Every individual we serve has a fundamental right to effective treatment. This means you have an ethical obligation to use interventions that are scientifically supported by research in applied behavior analysis. We do not use trendy, unproven therapies or experimental treatments that lack solid data. On the test, you will be expected to advocate for evidence-based practices and gently steer parents away from pseudoscientific methods that waste their time and money. Your clinical decisions must always be backed by the established science of human behavior. Along with effective treatment, clients have the right to experience the least restrictive procedures possible. This ethical rule dictates that we must always try reinforcement-based interventions before we ever consider using punishment or physical restraints. You only move to more restrictive, intrusive procedures if the positive methods have completely failed and the client is in immediate danger. The exam will heavily penalize you for choosing a harsh punishment procedure as a first option, so always look for the gentlest, most positive intervention path available. As a professional, you must strictly practice within your boundaries of competence. This means you only take on cases that match your specific education, training, and supervised experience. If you have spent 10 years working exclusively with young children with autism, you're not ethically competent to suddenly start treating adults with severe schizophrenia without extensive new training and supervision. Recognizing your own limits and referring clients out to other experts is a sign of a highly ethical and responsible behavior analyst. There will come a time when services must end, and the ethics code requires you to handle transitions and discontinuations safely. You can never simply abandon a client, even if they run out of funding or if the parents are difficult to work with. You must provide a written transition plan, offer continued services for a reasonable transition period, and help the family find a new provider. The certification exam will check your understanding that finishing a clinical relationship requires the exact same level of professional care as starting one. Now we will shift our focus to the personnel supervision portion of your exam. As a certified behavior analyst, you will rarely be the one implementing the daily therapy. Instead, you will supervise registered behavior technicians who do the direct work. Your ethical responsibility extends to everything your technicians do under your license. If a technician makes a terrible mistake, the board holds you responsible because you are the clinical supervisor. Therefore, effective, hands-on supervision is the only way to protect your clients and your own career. We must use objective, competency-based training when teaching our staff how to run behavior plans. This means you do not just hand a technician a written plan and hope they read it. You must physically watch them run the plan with the client and collect data on their accuracy. The exam will expect you to know that a technician is only truly trained when they can demonstrate the skill perfectly in the natural environment. Relying on simple verbal instructions to train staff is a major red flag on the test. Once your staff is trained, you must provide ongoing, effective performance feedback to keep their skills sharp. Good feedback is always timely, meaning you give it as close to the performance as possible, rather than waiting for a monthly meeting. It must also be highly specific, pointing out exactly what the technician did right and exactly what they need to change. Exam scenarios will often ask you to choose the best way to correct a staff member, and the answer is always delivering immediate, clear, and constructive feedback while they are still in the session. You must continuously evaluate the overall effects of your supervision to ensure you are actually doing a good job as a leader. The ultimate measure of your supervision quality is the progress of the clients. If you are meeting with your technicians every week, but the clients are not making any behavioral progress, your supervision strategy is failing and must be changed. The certification test will remind you that we apply the exact same scientific analysis to our own management skills as we do to our clients' behavior. When managing a team, you must be extremely careful about delegating tasks. You can only assign clinical tasks to technicians who have proven they are competent to handle them safely. Asking a brand new, inexperienced staff member to manage a client with severe self-injurious behavior is highly unethical and dangerous. On the exam, you must demonstrate that you assess the skill level of every individual employee before you assign them to specific cases or interventions, ensuring a perfect match between the staff's abilities and the client's needs. An increasingly important part of our ethical code is practicing cultural responsiveness and promoting diversity. You must actively recognize how your own personal biases and background affect your clinical decisions. It is your ethical duty to respect the diverse cultural values, religious beliefs, and family dynamics of the people you serve. If a behavior plan clashes with a family's deep cultural traditions, you must modify the plan to respect their home life. The exam highly prioritizes professionals who adapt to their clients, rather than forcing clients to conform to the clinic. Finally, you have an overarching responsibility to the profession of behavior analysis itself. This means you must represent the science accurately to the public, avoiding false or misleading statements about what behavior analysis can cure or achieve. It also means you have an ethical obligation to address the poor conduct of others. If you see a colleague violating the ethics code, you must first attempt to resolve it with him directly, and if that fails, you must report him to the board to protect the integrity of our field. Congratulations on successfully completing the final section of your ultimate study guide, and for finishing the entire course curriculum. You have done an incredible job mastering everything from basic philosophical concepts to complex experimental designs, and finally, the vital ethical standards that protect our clients. Before you celebrate, I strongly encourage you to complete the attached practice test for this final section. Engaging with these practice questions will solidify your understanding of these strict ethical rules and maximize your readiness for exam day. The practice test is included right here with this lesson. Thank you for your dedication to learning, stay confident, keep practicing, and go pass your certification exam.